Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Have a Seat with Chris Hansen. Tonight, we take a look at the George Floyd case. George Floyd, who was killed at the hands, many people say murdered, at the hands of police officers in Minneapolis, Minnesota, just a little over a week ago. The nation is at a turning point in many different ways. Unrest around the country, protests today in virtually every city across America, most of them peaceful. Last night, things got rough in New York City. They got rough in Atlanta the night before. Police officers have been shot at. There have been hundreds and hundreds of arrests. We're going to talk to some very interesting people tonight. Mary Sheffield, who is the president pro tem of the Detroit City Council, comes from a long line of civil rights leaders in this country. And we're going to talk to Sheriff Chris Swanson of Genesse County, Michigan, who actually marched with protesters and sent a very strong signal across the country as to potentially what can happen when police, law enforcement, and protesters and people who are upset with policing across the country can get together and send a message. Very important there. We want to start, though. We have Vinny LeVien, who's been on the show many times, as you know, who's live right now in New York City, where there was trouble last night. The curfew last night in New York City and Manhattan was 11 o'clock. Tonight, they moved it to 8 p.m. Vinny, what's happening? Are the streets busy? Is there more activity tonight with this curfew, or what's the situation as you see it right now?
Yeah, I mean, Chris, unfortunately, doesn't seem like it's been better since it started, going on now 5 days, if you can imagine. They're protesting, and being from New York, as you know, and running the emergency task force, if you see, I don't have my ETF jacket on or hat because we're being told that, the NYPD is being singled out, right? And because I'm crisscrossing the city, I basically have an undescript hat and jacket that I'm wearing right now.
What is the scene, though? Is it calmer in the city where you're at, as opposed to last night, where we saw maces being looted, we saw police being run into, we saw some relatively violent clashes along Fifth Avenue and in Times Square?
Well, as you know, it's early, and normally the peaceful protests that started today, they started down near City Hall and police headquarters and went up to Times Square, and then they continued up to Harlem. They were very peaceful, not many issues. But what happens is after 8 p.m. when the sun goes down, the protest and the people that are involved in the protest, and this has been directly from the NYPD Deputy Commissioner John Miller, who me and you know very well, counterterrorism intelligence. There's basically domestic terrorists that are involved in those protests that have systematically has logistics of bricks and Clorox and other weapons that they're using to attack the NYPD throughout New York City. They're very organized. They're very structured. I've seen it firsthand from the Barclays Center to Times Square to the Bronx, systematically not only shutting down bridges, but they then have, and as you know, and everybody that's listening here, when you see a scanner out and it says airmail is not FedEx. Airmail are bricks, are devices that can kill somebody. And when the NYPD is saying airmail is being thrown at us, that means something is bodily being thrown off a roof or thrown at them that can kill them. They call it airmail because they don't want people to actually know what that means. But for all your viewers out there, when you're listening to scanners, airmail is a device that can kill law enforcement personnel.
All right, Vinny, I know it's a busy night for you with the emergency task force and helping out NYPD. Thanks for checking in. We'll check in with you a little later in the show, but stay safe in New York City tonight, okay?
Thank you, Chris.
Thanks, Vinny. I appreciate it. Mary Sheffield, who is the president pro tem of the Detroit City Council, somebody from a long line of people involved in civil rights across this country. Mary, thanks for being with us tonight.
Thank you for having me, Chris.
So as a city council member in the city of Detroit, a longtime Detroiter, when you saw what happened to George Floyd in Minneapolis, what was your first reaction? And did you think that the nationwide outrage would be such as it is right now?
So many emotions went through me, and still to this day, it's hard to watch that video. But I do think that this particular time, any human who watched that video, I'm sure it sparked some type of emotion. I didn't expect it to be this big. But I mean, this has been decades long of African Americans crying out for help, for justice. We have been suffocating for decades, dealing with unemployment, mass incarceration, gun violence reform that we need in this country. And so it doesn't surprise me to see the unrest that is happening in this country. I know here in Detroit, this is the first time I've ever seen our city in the chaos that we're in right now in Detroit, with the amount of rallies and marches and protests and individuals that are coming from outside of our city in Detroit, causing disturbance and unrest in our city. And so I believe that the frustration, the anger is warranted, but I always continue to urge individuals to use it in a constructive way that actually truly brings about policy change in this country.
Mary, I have so many questions for you, and we've seen, over the years in Detroit, back from the time when I was a reporter there, and, stemming back to the race riots of the 40s, the race riots in 1967, the Malice Green murder in the early 90s. Detroit has been sometimes a hotbed for this sort of racial violence, but also with the chief who's in place now, James Craig, it's been sort of a model of policing and how protesters can peacefully get their point across and get along in some respects with police. And we saw the deputy chief get down on his knee and appeal to the some of the protesters. But we also saw outsiders.
Yeah.
A large percent of those arrested came from outside of the city of Detroit. So how do you balance this? I mean, obviously there's outrage and justifiably, but there are people taking advantage of this in Detroit and as Vinny just said, in New York City and everywhere else tonight.
Most definitely. And I think we as Detroiters have come together and have made sure that we make sure that the message is very clear that while Detroit does not have it all together, we are a model city. We are grateful for the relationship that we have with the Detroit Police Department. We have community policing here, neighborhood police officers. We have an independent commission that oversees our Detroit Police Department. And so we may not be the best, but we have a pretty good relationship with our Detroit Police Department, and we are proud of that. And so we are not going to allow outsiders to come into our city and take the narrative away and really disrespect the relationship and the culture that it has taken a lot of time to build here in the city of Detroit. And so we believe that people in Detroit have a reason and to protest. We respect it as long as it's done in a peaceful and respectful way. But any disrespect towards our Detroit Police Department, I watched Deputy Bettison, Chief Bettison, a couple of days ago, who was almost in tears just in regards to the disrespect that he has seen recently towards Detroit Police Department. He didn't understand it because the way in which our police department has engaged with the community, he believes is a model, and we do too. And so we respect Detroit Police Department, and we are not allowing the narrative to take away from what we have built here in the city of Detroit.
Mary, we talk about police relationships, law enforcement relationships with the community, specifically in this case, an outraged Black community. And I have many, many questions for you, but I want you to hang with me just for a minute because I want to switch over to the Genesse County Sheriff, Chris Swanson. You probably recognize him. He's been in the media the last couple of days. Sheriff Swanson, thanks for being with us tonight.
Thank you, and thank you to my guest.
Well, listen, let's get right to it. The sheriff was out the other night over the weekend and faced with a big demonstration, and I'm going to let him tell the story, but he actually ended up stepping down onto the same level as the protesters and marching with them. Sheriff, set this up for me because it's a story worth telling on many different levels, especially when you talk about the relationship between law enforcement and protesters coming off this horrible event in Minneapolis. Set the stage for me. What happened? What did you see and what were you preparing for?
Well, like Vinny said and the Councilwoman, when you see that video, 8 minutes and 46 seconds destroys years and years of inroads to a community. And we are not as big as NYPD, and Flint is the little brother of Detroit. And each one of us have our own challenges. But one thing we have is we have a police presence and a community that we have to relate to. And it is an everyday, all the time type model. And what we saw was that erased George Floyd's incident, took us back so far. And it was devastating and horrifying for more reason than the human being who was murdered at the hands of somebody who wore our uniform, but that wasn't us. And every day we saw the tensions build throughout the nation. And then on Friday, it just went buck wild. And here in Flint, we knew that there were demonstrations, and we knew they were going to be here timely, and we prepared like everybody else. And as this progressed and throughout the night, it grew and grew and grew. Around 8 o'clock, 8:30 at dusk time, they turned towards a local police department. And we saw what happened in Oregon. We saw what happened at CNN. We saw what happened in Minneapolis. And as they came towards the police department, not the sheriff's office, but a local police, Flint Township, they were calling out to fortify the line. And as I was walking towards, as the sheriff, I'm an on-the-ground sheriff, and we have a large police department, and I am on the street, and I enjoy that. I've been on the job 27 years today, and that's where I get my best view. And I saw the crowd come, and I thought, how did we get here? Like, how did a week and a half ago we became heroes, and now we are the biggest villains in the nation? And that line, just like you see everywhere else, whether it's Detroit or LA or San Francisco or Miami, or wherever those demonstrations are, became so enraged because there was righteous anger. And when they came up to the line, you had fear on both sides. And don't make a mistake to think that cops aren't scared. There was fear. We'd not been in this situation. You didn't know what was going to happen, how it was going to bubble over. But long story short, we held our line, and there was so much rage and so much tension I had not experienced before in my career. As I looked down the line, I didn't know who started it, what the instigation was, but I saw a fist bump. I saw an attempt for a hug by a couple people, and I said, that's it. I took my helmet off. We dropped the batons and probably made the worst tactical move possible, especially when you hear about airmail and NYPD. I mean, that breaks my heart. But it was an instinct, and every cop will tell you that based on training and experience, and sometimes the best teacher is your gut. I walked into the crowd. I saw the first shot caller. I said, hey, come here, man. I gave him a hug, and I said, listen, that guy is not who we are. I said, these guys love you. These cops will die for you. I said, what do you need? He goes, you need to tell the people. And I said, you gather them up. And they all turned and said what I said, and that we are not who they are. We're better, and we want you to know that. But it's really the second question that in Flint, it put us on the map for something positive. And I said, what else do you need? And you have a group that wasn't even organized, but together, almost in stereo, they hollered out, walk with us. And when I watched the video a day or two later, because obviously I was in the moment at that point, I could just see in my head, like I didn't expect that, but it made the most sense. And again, by instinct, I'd like to say there was a plan. It wasn't by being macho or anything other than that. It's just, I know my community, just like the councilwoman said, you got to know your people. And I said, let's walk, and we'll walk all night. And that was the turning point that melted the hearts, that gave a voice, a listening ear. And it showed vulnerability, which in my opinion, in police work, many times vulnerability is probably frowned upon. But when you're the chief law enforcement officer and you've been on the street your whole adult life, I saw that vulnerability as a strength and a message to a hurting community.
Sheriff, when you got up that morning, you knew that you potentially faced this kind of a standoff with angry protesters because of the George Floyd murder at the hands of police. Did you formulate a plan going into this? Was this absolutely spontaneous? And what was going through your mind as you stepped off into this crowd, taking what by all law enforcement standards would be considered to be a huge risk?
You know, I'd like to say that we had an ops plan for that, and I thought about it, but it has none of that. I wasn't trying to be any more than that was the best tactic at the time. And police officers that have a gut instinct many times has saved their life. That gut instinct was what I felt at the time was the right thing to do. And that day, you're right, I didn't plan it. I didn't know where it was going to go. And it was just the moment that hit. There was a 50-50 shot. I'll be honest with you. It was either going to work or it wasn't going to work, but I didn't think twice about it. And as you go back and talk to cops, and you know this, Chris, most cops in a high stress situation, whether it's a shooting or whether it's a chase or whether it's a fight for your life, they react based on how they're trained. They react based on how their experience has kept them in that lane. And many times when you ask those questions to those cops, they'll say, I don't know how it happened. It just happened. And that's the best way I can describe it. It wasn't anything more than it was the moment to do what I did. And it turned out to put Flint on the map. And protesters that I now are friends with, Quan Adams, Jeff Hawkins, who I'd known for a long time, Quan never met, Dwan Robinson and Mr. Franklin III, they saw that. And they're like, okay, we got a voice here. He's listening. He's a white officer. He's the top sheriff. He's going to be there with us. And that marching, that action, let me just say this, is I don't know NYPD, I don't know Detroit knows, but I do know Flint. And in this example, I felt that when you lay down your swords and law enforcement, because that's what got us here in the first place, a bad decision that murdered a guy, takes the first step, the people responded. And that's the message you see now throughout the nation. And I might add, what's happened in Detroit, you heard the councilwoman say it, what's happened in NYPD and all these, those are not protesters. Those are criminals that are creating a criminal act against people's houses, their businesses. We're talking peaceful protesters that have the constitutional right to assemble and speak and do the right thing. And we need to protect those people and give them the voice. And protesters got us this country in the first place, but the lawlessness is the problem. And I feel so badly for Vinny and all those cops out there and then what's happened at DPD. We were blessed. We've got 4 days of demonstration. They're demonstrating right outside on our front lawn. No arrests, no injuries, no fires.
When you did this, Sheriff, what was the turning point in your mind when you realized, okay, I did the right thing here, and this is important. This is significant for race relations, for police and civilian relations, and it sends a message to the rest of the world, to the rest of the United States at least, that, okay, we need to change up what we do to heal.
You know, you'll find that in being a law enforcement, there could be 6 different options for one particular incident. And sometimes you don't know which one is the best one, and sometimes you don't pick the best one. But on that day, it was the best option. But I didn't realize that till about 5-6 minutes as we started walking. I had one of my guys to my left, I had one to my right, and as the crowd kept moving, of course, I was high-fiving, I was talking to people, but on the outside, I was looking to see from their reaction, what's behind me? Did the whole group come? Is the police department safe? Do I have all the officers? It was almost like a movement that I had to make sure that all followed through. And about 4 or 5 minutes into it, we walked about, maybe a quarter mile. I looked at my guy and I said, "Are we good?" He goes, "We're good, boss." And I said, "How's the police department?" He says, "It's good." And I said, "This is unbelievable." He goes, "This is incredible." And you just saw hearts melt. So let me just say, it turned out the best it possibly could. And Flint has been on the map so long for crime and poverty and the water crisis and General Motors and all sorts of things, pandemic, DPD. I mean, Wayne County's been hit more than any county in the state of Michigan between cases and deaths. They've lost cops. They've lost sheriff's deputies. We've had so much pain. We don't need more undue stress. And when that whole movement happened, I started talking. I'm like, you guys are making history tonight. You're showing the world you can protest in peace. You can get your righteous anger out where people are listening. We're making history. Little did I know that it would send a global message that police have to be the ones that start it and protests can be peaceful.
You've been in law enforcement, Sheriff, for 27 years. When you saw what happened in Minneapolis between the police and George Floyd, what went through your mind?
I'm the youngest of 4. My dad was Detroit police during the riots. My grandpa had 32 years on the job. And I grew up with stories of my dad talking about what happened in Detroit. And there's one thing that he said, it was only one incident that triggered everything else. It was a tipping point, and the city went into burn. And I never forgot that. And when I saw what happened to Mr. Floyd, on top of all those other things, Mr. Aubrey, who was shot running through a neighborhood, are you kidding me? I just waiting for the boiling point. And that happened. The frustration hit so hard. And you know what was frustrating is as a police officer, I mean, I can tell you throughout, there's 800,000 cops in the United States. There's hundreds of thousands working right now, missing all sorts of activities from their kids. And before the pandemic, we're missing soccer games and birthday parties and working weekends and holidays. And we don't do it for the fame and fortune. And one person repeated over all these times. You talk about Malice Green and all the ones throughout history. It's like, when can we be done with this? When can police make a decision that, okay, how is this going to look? When is the maturity of the police officer on the street going to help the rest of the cops who make great decisions? Because when I look at that, Chris, imagine a police officer prone on the ground in uniform, in handcuffs, and somebody from the outside on the back of their neck, and 3 cops show up on scene. What's going to happen? There's going to be a shooting, and it's going to be a justified shooting. How can you, in your right mind, you're a veteran, allegedly, you're a veteran, and you're so cavalier on the back of someone's neck, and the people are begging, he's begging, like you just killed a buck? Are you kidding me? It was disgusting, and that's not who cops are. It's a noble field, and cops need to be proud to be there. But it's going to take us to make the change from the top down, and that's why when I see chiefs and sheriffs and deputy chiefs buck up and lay down at their sabers and kneel down with their people, the burden falls on us, Chris. It's not going to solve every situation, but it worked in Flint, Michigan.
You know, you look at the video, and of course, we don't have every piece of video that the Attorney General is looking at in the state of Minnesota, the district attorney there. But it appears that none of this justified lethal force. You're talking about a charge of a $20 bill maybe being counterfeit to buy cigarettes. There seems to be a history between the officer involved and George Floyd, perhaps working at the same restaurant, nightclub, and security, and just the calm of the officer as he kept the knee on Mr. Floyd's neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds.
Yeah.
And the other officers just kind of watching. I mean, look, I've been around law enforcement my entire career, 40 years. I've done ride-alongs. I've done raids back in the old days, you know, covering Detroit. You know, we did a series when you could get away with this. It would be the shotgun, you know, the Ram, the Helican, the shotgun, my cameraman, and me. I mean, we used to get away with that and go in there on these raids when you know, we were doing the Chambers Brothers case and the No Crack Task Force. So I've seen it, you know, and you know, I've had the pleasure of knowing many, many fine men and women in law enforcement, but this, I can't make sense of what was going on here, whether it was something in the past, was there something that happened in the car that upset this officer to the point of acting this way? I can't explain the actions in my mind. Can you?
No, there's nothing to explain. That trial's over in 8 minutes, 46 seconds. That's over. You don't need to know what happened in the beginning. You don't need to know anything other than what that video shows. And trust me, I'm all into getting the full investigation, but there's some things that you don't need anything more. And you're spot on. The attitude and the arrogance of that guy on the back of the neck while people are begging for him to move, there's no room. In law enforcement, and this is one of the changes that things happen, and that's why I say it, I've said it all over the world, George Floyd changed American policing. Because if we dare go back to the way we were before this thing started, after what we're seeing right now, then shame on us. And when you see that and you don't call a wrong and you don't get in front of it, then we're going to be back here talking about the same thing next time it happens.
And any insight as somebody who leads a, you know, sheriff's department, law enforcement agency, as to why these other officers have not yet been questioned, taken into custody, that surprises me just based upon my experience in these cases.
You know, I don't know the answer to that, but it's a murder investigation. You know, I'm not there when they charge them a third degree. We don't have third degree in Michigan, so I don't know all the specifics, but I do know this. I got a deputy sheriff in jail right now because last year he did a criminal sexual conduct while on duty and he's charged with life offenses. I've arrested people out of their own houses. I've arrested my own friends. We're doing investigations right now because of heavy-handedness. Every police department's going to have that, whether you're 25,000, whether you're size of NYPD, or you have a department of 2. You got to hold your people accountable. And that means that if you see wrong and you don't call it out, you're just as complicit.
Sheriff, I know you have to run here. What message do you hope this sends out to police, sheriff's departments across the country tonight as we try to resolve these issues and try to, you know, make America safer for everyone?
Well, there's certainly some that have it easier than others. And you're talking to one here in a minute. But I will say this to the cops, man, do not give up on the most noble career on the planet. Don't give up on your community. Don't you become enraged, even though you're in the thick of it. I get it, but we are created to be the people's guardian. Do not give up on your community. If you tried 10,000 times, try one more. And for the people, I'm talking the good people that want this change to happen. Give your cops a chance. Give your cops a chance. Don't judge them based on bad acts. Don't judge them on the history. And when those two things collide, then we're going to see the change. It's got to be action. People are tired of empty words, empty promises. They're tired of people that don't know what it's like on the street, but they got to have mutual cooperation. It has to start with the police. The burden falls on us, just like a force continuum. The burden falls on us. If we want to make this change, the burden falls on us.
Sheriff Chris Swanson, Genesee County, Michigan, which encompasses Flint, just north of Detroit. Thank you very much for being with us tonight. Thank you for sharing your story. I think it has the potential to have a lot of impact and already has. You take care, stay safe, and we'll stay in touch.
Thank you, friend.
Mary Sheffield, you heard what the sheriff said there. Not far from where you are in Detroit, there's a fellow whose dad was a Detroit police officer in the riots, 1967. Your dad, grandfather, involved in those civil rights causes. What's your takeaway from that story?
You know, I just want to say, I first of all, thank Sheriff Swanson, because listening to him and hearing his energy, his compassion, really just gave me a lot of hope. And I'm hoping that his energy and his story will spread to cities all around this country. I think some of what we're experiencing is that some of the protesters just want to see that compassion and that officers hear us, right? And so it doesn't always have to be an adversarial relationship. What Sheriff Swanson was able to show us is that officers can stand with us, and that we can have peaceful protests throughout this country. And so I just really commend what he's doing. And we've had that here in Detroit, where we had Deputy Chief Bettison kneel with our protesters here in Detroit. And so it can happen, and we're hoping that we can be a model city and spread that message throughout cities around this country.
Mary, yesterday, the president had a photo opportunity in front of St. John's Church. The authorities cleared the pathway from the White House using tear gas. An Australian television crew got roughed up, and for no real good reason. I mean, I watched this video 3 or 4 times today, and the Australian cameraman was tucked into a safe spot. If you're a cameraman, that's a place to be. The world can pass you by. Tear gas can fly over. You're safe. And he got jammed up pretty rough. And this was live on TV in Australia, apparently. This continues, using tear gas and brute force to clear the path so the president can walk across to St. John's Church, Episcopal Church, and stand there for a photo op, not really say anything, and hold up the Holy Bible. Somebody asked if that was the president's Bible. He said, it's a Bible. Now, let me just, for anybody who doesn't know, your father is a minister. Your grandfather was a minister who was an advisor to the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. Mm-hmm. To see somebody like that invoke the Bible, a church, for a photo op, how do you react to that?
You know, I just think it's unfortunate. I mean, we have a country that is crying out for change. We have a country that clearly is saying we want justice, we want equality. And I think this president is doing everything that he can to distract from addressing the root issues of why we are here, why we are where we are today. And so I think it's unfortunate that he's using the Bible as a political tool, when the Bible is about peace, it's about love, it's about hope and justice. And all of those are things that our president has not addressed or even given us a message of hope in times of hurt and pain that this country is experiencing. And so it would be really good to hear our president deliver an inspirational message during these very trying times, because Black and brown people through this country are hurting. We want change, and this president has failed to really address those systemic issues of injustice throughout this country. And to use a photo opportunity with the Bible and to inject religion in the midst of all of this, I just think is very, very unfortunate. And I think that we need to be aware of that as we move forward in this country when it comes to voting as well.
The other comments this past week that really offended a lot of people from the president, one saying that if anybody were to breach the White House fence, they'd be met by vicious dogs and ominous weapons. Your reaction to that?
You know, I think this president, again, is all about law and order, scare tactics against peaceful protesters who will have a right to a freedom of speech. And again, I think he is doing everything to distract himself from addressing why people are protesting. Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King said, rioting is the language of the unheard. And people have not been heard, and this president is not addressing the cry of the people. And so until those issues are addressed, I truly believe that the rioting and the unrest will continue.
You know, you have to wonder, based upon what Sheriff Swanson said, based upon what we saw in that horrific video from Minneapolis, what if that police officer had treated George Floyd the way that the sheriff treated the protesters, the way the deputy chief in Detroit, the chief in Detroit had treated protesters? What if he just said, look, man, it's a bad $20 bill. This is, come on, cut it out. What if we're not having this discussion? I mean, you hope that, George Floyd was not murdered in vain, that we change, we get better here. But I mean, I have seen countless times in my career, police officers, federal agents use common sense and diffuse situations and not pull a gun. And yet you see this. I mean, what do you expect people across the country to do when you see something like that? 8 minutes and 46 seconds.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. I think, it goes back to how people value African-American lives. Had this been anyone else, had this been a white person, would this have happened? And so we would have loved to see what had happened with Sheriff Swanson, if something like that could have happened in this situation. But unfortunately, I think the value of Black lives in this country is just unfortunate. And we want justice, we want equality in this situation. And I just think that until we get to a point where officers in this country values Black and brown lives, we will continue to be where we are today.
The Justice Department launched a civil rights investigation into the Minneapolis Police Department today. You've got a department where the chief there is African-American. You would think that there would be some sensitivity to these issues like we see in Detroit with James Craig, who's very much respected as a police chief. Is that enough, a civil rights investigation on the part of the federal government?
I think it's a step in the right direction. I know the family also was calling for an independent investigation. I know an independent autopsy was done as well too. But whatever will lead to a path of true justice for the family, I think is what community and we are demanding as a country. And so I think a civil rights investigation is something that will be helpful. Anything coming from the federal government, though, I think we have to be cautious of as well too. So, but any type of independent investigation, I think, will be thorough and help seek justice for the family will be beneficial.
What is your hope? Where do we go from here? I know that's a broad question, and I'm putting a lot of pressure on your shoulders there as a politician and opinion leader in this country. But where do we go? How do we handle all this? I mean, is it another civil rights investigation, 4 cops charged and convicted of murder, a sad funeral, next week in Houston for George Floyd, grieving people in the streets? How do we take it to the next level where we actually see some change when it comes to institutional racism in America today?
Yeah. So I think we have a unique opportunity in this country to use this momentum. As a young millennial myself, I've never experienced anything like this ever. And so I've been telling young people that we have to go beyond just protesting and rallying, that this momentum and this energy has to go beyond this. And so voting, I think, is going to be extremely important, especially getting involved in our local elections. We know that our mayors appoint chiefs in various cities. And so our young people need to get involved in local elections. I also just think it's important that, again, that the momentum and the rallying does not just stop, right? That we continue and demand what we want to see from a systemic standpoint. And so I know there's a lot of conversations happening in the African-American community about what those demands are. What exactly do we want? What is the agenda of African-Americans in this country that we can put forward on a federal level, state level, and local level? And so I just believe that we have the ability, and where we should go from here is having some very serious conversations about what inclusion and justice and equality looks like in this country, and how African Americans can really get justice. And I think that those conversations are happening, and I'm really, really encouraged, and hopefully hope that things will get better in this country.
Detroit has had strong African American leadership for many years. Coleman Young and John Conyers and so many people in the clergy and local government. I mean, I'm going to miss some people, so I hazard to even try to list them all. Yourself being among the new guard here. From where you sit as a millennial, what do you want to see happen? What do you want personally, and what do you want to see for America?
You know, I think what I want is justice. I want equality. I want African Americans to receive the same treatment and respect and dignity as everyone else, not to be treated as second-class citizens. You know, we pledge allegiance for liberty and justice for all. And I want this country to stand true to that. The color of our skin should not dictate how we're treated and whether or not we live or die when we encounter situations with the police department. And so I want to be a part of a country who values love, right? Unity, justice. And I think that we have lost some of those values. And so that is what I'm fighting for. That is what I believe in. I believe here in Detroit that we have to get back to being a city of inclusion and unity here too. I mean, we've made a lot of progress. The city of Detroit is at a time where we are revitalizing. We're seeing investment come in Detroit, but we still have to make sure that the African Americans are included in that revitalization is here as well too. And so my thing is just making sure that there's equality and justice for all. Black, brown, orange, blue, gray, doesn't matter the color, but we all are equal. We're treated equally and have inclusion and justice.
What do you say to the president tonight?
You know, I say to the president, you know, we need leadership. We elected you to lead for all of us. I didn't vote for him, let me first of all say that, but he is elected to represent all of us. And in a time of crisis, in a time where people are crying out for help, for change, who are angry, we need a message of unity. We need a message of hope and encouragement. And we need a message that this country will address the issues that people are frustrated about. And we have not seen that. We've seen divisiveness, but we need a message of unity and love and hope. And I hope that this president will have the courage to do that. If not, I hope that people will get to the polls and vote so that we can bring this country together.
And what do you say to the protesters, Mary Sheffield, tonight, who likely will continue for many days to come as the outrage continues?
So to the protesters, I say that you have a right to be upset, to be frustrated, to be angry, but let's make sure that we do it in a peaceful and respectful way. I also think that rallying and protesting, as I mentioned, is just one part of the result in the solution to this whole problem. And so we have to continue to use that and organize. I come from a family of organizers and mobilizers, and they did things very strategic and organized. And so let's make sure that we have a organized message. We know what we're asking for, and we do it in a peaceful and respectful way. I do not believe that violence will bring any change in this country. We know that hate doesn't drive out hate, only love does. And so we have to do this in a loving way, but still understand that we have a right to be upset. We have a right to be angry, and we have a right to protest and rally. But let's make sure we do it in a peaceful way that does not bring violence in our cities.
Do you still experience racism today in this city, in Detroit? And at what level? And what is your level of frustration because of it? I know it's a very personal question, but I think it's legitimate given everything that's going on here.
You know, I would say I've seen racist policies. As a policy maker, I will more so speak to seeing policies that I believe benefit, white individuals or the white class per se, more so than African Americans. So I do believe that there is some racism that is embedded in policies. And that's why I always say it's so important to vote. When you see things like our insurance issue in Detroit, where African Americans, we have some of the highest insurance rates in the country. And when you cross 8 Mile, the insurance drastically drops. right? And so redlining is taking place in Detroit. And so I think that there is racism that definitely still exists. But I think a lot of it is not as explicit, but it's implicit. It's embedded in policies. And you may not see it as much, but it definitely still is here living.
My nephew, who's 18, is also my godson. He's also African American. He's a standout athlete, kid of impeccable character. Yet because he lives in a predominantly white suburb, my sister, his mother, has to counsel him on a daily basis. When you come out of practice, don't wear your hood up. When you drive around in the car, you make sure your license and registration is attached to the visor so you can get it easily without fussing around in the car. It's unfortunate, but it's reality still in this country today. What do you say to young people and how they should not just act, but I guess how to be leaders, how to be agents of change, how to not have to live that way?
Mm-hmm. You know, I always think it's important to equip yourself with knowledge, with information. You know, when we learn and expand our knowledge, we become so powerful. And so I always tell young people to learn their history, learn about our forefathers, our ancestors, all of the civil rights giants that taught us so much about organizing and civil rights. And definitely as it relates to the police department, you know, just understanding your rights, how to have an encounter with the Detroit Police Department, things that you should say, how you should be respectful. It's unfortunate that we have to have those conversations, but I think they're definitely warranted in this time, in this climate, in this country. But I always just tell our young people that they are leaders and they have to use their voice and they have to find their individual passions and how they can gear that towards various social movements that are happening in this country. But
what do you see, Mary, as we wrap up? And thank you for that. What do you see happening in the election over the next just a little less than 6 months? We saw Joe Biden today make a speech and was very forceful and very emotional and took on the president today. How do you see this playing out?
You know, I'm really hoping that this, what we're seeing in this country will spark interest in an entire, you know, demographic of voters that we have not been able to tap into in the past. And that people now more than ever are, you know, really wanting to get engaged in the political process now that they see how this directly benefits and impacts their quality of life. And so my hope is that people will take their anger and their frustration to the polls and actually vote on someone who's going to deliver and has the courage to address the systemic issues in this country. And not only that, but demand that each of the individuals that are running have a platform on how they're going to address these issues. I think for far too long, African Americans feel that we have voted for people and placed them in office, and that our agenda, our concerns, our demands have not been met. And so for the first time, I'm actually seeing some of those very, very serious conversations and dialogue happening that is saying, we're not going to just vote for you just because you're Democrat or Republican or whatever it may be. We want to know exactly how you are going to address the issues that African Americans have been crying out for far too long. And so my hope is that we'll have a very good turnout in this election and really get some changes in this country.
What's the conversation, Mary, between you and your friends, associates, professionals your age? What's the talk based upon what happened in Minneapolis and what's happened since?
You know, the main talk is what is next? You know, how can we use this energy and this momentum to bring about change? A lot of people do not want to see this end. This is the first time that I've ever experienced anything like this. And a lot of young people, this is the first time. And so people are trying to figure out, what can I really do to make a difference? How can we keep this going? And so I think, again, a lot of the conversations are how collectively can we come together and create an agenda, our demands, our asks, what do we want? And really just keep this momentum going. So I think that is the main conversation that I've seen among a lot of different organizations and community members is what is next, and how do we keep this momentum going to create change?
And what do you want? What is the most important thing? I know you want people to vote, and I know you've talked about that. You want people to, you know, to be motivated and to seize this moment, as tragic as it is. But if you had to choose the first thing, and I know I'm putting you on the spot here, and I promise I'll let you go after this, but what's on the top of your list, Mary?
So many different issues. It's so many different issues packed into all of this. I think probably justice, justice and equality is what we are demanding. Justice. I mean, there's been several times that African Americans, and some of which are not even recorded on the phones, and we never makes it to the media, where our African American lives are being taken at the hands of police officers. And not even just justice in that sense, but justice in housing, right? Justice in mass incarceration, justice in every single area where African Americans continue to be oppressed and not treated equally. And so that is what I think we're demanding, justice and equality.
I wonder in these circumstances, and I'm sure you do too, what if there wasn't a cell phone video of this? What if the video didn't finally get released in Georgia for young Aubrey? We wouldn't ever know about these things. And that leads me to my question: what is the media's responsibility? What is my responsibility? What are all the other reporters' responsibilities to make sure that this doesn't die down, that this remains a topic of searing conversation and analysis in this country?
Making sure that you all continue to tell the story. Media plays a huge role. I mean, if it wasn't for some of the media picking up the recorded murder of George Floyd, we wouldn't be here where we are today. So media plays a tremendous role in keeping this momentum going and actually telling the stories of communities that are on the ground doing work, positive stories as well in various cities. And so media plays a crucial role outside of just the traditional mainstream media. We need all types of local media as well too, to tell the various stories that are happening within various communities throughout the country.
Mary Sheffield, thank you very much for being with us tonight. Final thoughts, anything else you want people to know as we continue to work our way through this as a nation?
No, I just want to thank you again for allowing me to be on. And I think, there is a paradigm shift happening in this country. I really believe so. And we all have a unique opportunity to capitalize on this momentum. And so I just encourage people to continue to fight, use their voice to create change in this country, because I do believe that it's coming and it's much needed. So I'm looking forward to the change that will take place.
Mary Sheffield, thank you very much. It's always a pleasure. It's great to see you. Again, I take some matter of pride in knowing you and your family for so many years, and it's really great to have you on here. And I promise we'll keep this conversation going. Thanks. You have a wonderful night, and I'll speak to you soon.
Thank you so much, Chris.
All right, Mary Sheffield, who's the president pro tem of the Detroit City Council, and in many ways the future of this country when it comes to politics and what people need to do, say, and think, and move this country forward. There's so much to talk about on this. What's happening in New York, what's happening in Minneapolis, what's happening in Detroit, what's happening in Atlanta. We saw so many things this week, and the issue of people taking advantage of this and the protesters and the looters. Obviously, nobody stands for that, but hopefully we'll get some sense of healing and some sense of momentum for justice. George Floyd's funeral will be Tuesday of next week in Houston. There will also be some other ceremonies involving that and a lot of discussion as we move forward. Painful stuff, but necessary stuff. Thank you for tuning in for this special edition of Have a Seat with Chris Hansen. We will continue our reporting on this. We'll also be back tomorrow night at a regular time at 8 o'clock as we continue our investigation into the Davi vanity case. So tune in then. In the meantime, I'll be watching. Take care. Have a good night.